Hi, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the Federal Communications Commission's new broadband data collection and specifically the Fabric Bulk Challenge process. I'm Jean Cadieux, Chair of the Broadband Data Task Force here at the FCC. The Broadband Data Collection, or as we call it, the BDC, is a new framework for collecting information on broadband service availability born out of the Broadband Data Act. As most of you participating today know, the new BDC program is collecting granular, location-level information on fixed broadband service availability throughout the country. The broadband maps the FCC will create from these new data will play a critical role in the efforts of federal, state, and tribal governments to ensure that essential broadband services are made available throughout the United States, and that broadband infrastructure funding is carefully targeted to the areas most in need. And for the first time ever, these data will be subject to review by individuals, governmental entities, and other third parties, as well as verification by the FCC. And this is where you come in. Entities such as state, local, and tribal governments and service providers will be able to submit bulk challenges to the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, which we'll describe in greater detail in a minute, starting on September 12th, which is next Monday. Consumers and others will be able to submit individual fabric challenges once the maps are published in November. The goal of the fabric challenge is to ensure that the fabric is as comprehensive and accurate a data set of broadband serviceable locations as possible. The information we will share during this webinar will help those entities prepare for the bulk challenge process and to align their data with the characteristics of the broadband serviceable locations, or BSLs, that make up the fabric, so they can help us identify locations where a BSL may be missing or misidentified. We've reserved some time for questions after the presentations, so participants are encouraged to email questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov, and we'll do our best to answer them as time allows. If we're unable to answer a specific question today, you may submit your question via the FCC's online BDC Help Center at www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. You can find additional information and technical assistance resources, including tutorial videos and FAQs, on that Help Center website. Following the initial bulk fabric challenge system demonstration and presentations, we'll take a brief break before the Q&A session begins. And as a reminder, you can email questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov throughout the event today. We appreciate your taking the time to watch this webinar and hope that it will be helpful as you prepare to file bulk challenges to the fabric data. With that, let's start the presentations. I'll hand it off to Chelsea Fallon, who is the Senior Implementation Officer of the Broadband Data Task Force. Chelsea?
Thank you, Jean. I'm going to start with a brief overview of what the fabric is and how it's used in BDC. So the fabric is a data set of all the locations, the buildings or structures in the country where broadband internet access service has been or could be installed. It is essentially a list of every residence and small business in the country with a unique identifier, an address, and geographic coordinates assigned to each structure, along with some other information. The fabric has been developed for the broadband data collection so that we, the FCC, providers, and the public, can work from a single standardized universal set of locations for the collection and reporting of fixed broadband availability. It serves as the denominator, in a sense, in determining where broadband service is available and where it is not. When fixed broadband providers file their data in the BDC system on where they make service available, they have two options for submitting their data. One is a list of locations, and the other is a polygon coverage area in a GIS format. Those that choose to submit a list of locations must use the fabric, and specifically the unique identifiers for each location as the basis for that list. The Fabric dataset is made available, this dataset that's made available for download actually includes two files, the active locations and the secondary addresses. The active locations file has a record for every location, along with information about that location, such as the address, the geographic coordinates, the number of units, the building type, the land use code, the census block that it falls in, and importantly, an indicator of whether or not the location is a broadband serviceable location. The secondary addresses file is there for locations that have more than one address associated with them. So those additional addresses are in that file. And that can be helpful for ISPs to use in address matching for their BDC data. And as I noted, the active locations file includes not only locations that meet the definition of a broadband serviceable location, or BSL, which Kirk is going to discuss, but also other locations that are not considered BSLs. And this is indicated by the BSL flag field in the data set. And with that, I will turn it over to Kirk Berge, Senior Counsel for the Broadband Data Task Force, who will discuss the definition of a broadband serviceable location.
Thank you, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as Chelsea mentioned, I'm going to talk about what is a BSL, and as we'll discuss, there's a lot of hard work that goes into making this determination. The Broadband Data Act, which required us to engage in the new collection, and subsequent FCC orders require that we collect broadband availability data specifically for mass market broadband locations. It's important to keep in mind that the Fabric is not a compendium of all structures or addresses or housing units in the country, only those that meet the definition of broadband serviceable location. So we're going to spend some time now to familiarize challengers with the characteristics of BSLs so that their challenges will focus on locations in the Fabric where BSL may be missing or misidentified. We also urge challengers to review the prior commission orders and public notices and other materials that describe the characteristics of a BSL. So at the highest level, a BSL is a location that can or should be able to receive mass market fixed broadband services. The commission requires that BSLs be defined as a set of geographic coordinates, that is a latitude and a longitude, that are within a building footprint. Of course, there's no single data set that meets those requirements exactly, so the Fabric combines a number of underlying source data sets to generate a comprehensive list of BSLs. Most of the locations in the Fabric are on a single location property or parcel with only one building on it. Think here of a single family home parcel. Identifying a BSL is relatively straightforward in those circumstances. Then there's a bit more to do once those locations have been identified, to add data sources that capture the address of that location, but it's relatively straightforward to identify a BSL for a single home. So not always that simple, though. Sometimes there are multiple residential or commercial buildings with multiple tenants on a single property. Think of apartments or condo complexes or shopping malls. In most of those cases, we typically consider each separate building or structure on the property to be a distinct BSL. In addition, when a single location parcel has multiple structures on it, including structures that are not housing units, we consider and have tried to identify the primary residential structure or home on the property as the Fabric location. There's some exceptions to that general approach that come with the mass market broadband requirements. Community anchor institutions, for example, things like schools, government buildings, or large enterprises, often don't subscribe to mass market broadband. We use the data we have available to exclude such locations from being BSLs, but they do appear in the Fabric with the BSL indicator that Chelsea mentioned set as false. As Chelsea also mentioned, providers need to exclude these locations where the BSL indicator is false from their availability filings. I'll end this brief description of a very complicated process by noting that the data can be messy. Different data sources can contradict one another. Data sources are very limited in certain areas of the country. Data are inconsistent across different areas. That's why there's a challenge process in place to help us correct data and improve the fabric over time. And now Jim Stegman, president of CostQuest, will provide a walkthrough of how the fabric was created. Jim?
Thank you, Kirk. And Kimmy, if you could put up the slides that I'll walk through. So as Kirk indicated, I will cover how the fabric is created. Our task in creating this fabric is to identify all the broadband serviceable locations, or what we call BSLs, in the country. With these locations identified, we then identify the key attributes associated with those BSLs, such as units, addresses, the building type code. This building type code captures whether the location is residential, business, a group quarter, an enterprise location, or a community anchor. Before we discuss challenge efforts, let me walk you through the initial process of identifying these BSL locations that you have looked at already. So on the slide that you see, the process combines multiple data sources. In the first image, on the left-hand side, we start with a blank slate. Basically, we're looking at aerial imagery of the country, trying to determine in that aerial image, what information can we pull from that and what BSLs can we identify. The first source of data that is brought in to the process are parcel boundaries. That's in the center image that you see on that. It's the red outlines that you see. These parcel boundaries represent county-level data showing land ownership. So we pull these from a separate vendor that we work with. That vendor collects these from the county data sets that are typically made publicly available, and then we adjust those boundaries into our process. In our efforts, the parcels provide a geographic scope for looking and determining what are the BSLs. So when there's a collection of buildings, when we know the parcel, we look at the collection of buildings within that parcel to make our determination. In the image on the right, we now bring in building footprint data. Building footprints are extracted from aerial and satellite imagery using deep learning methods. These building footprints represent candidates for BSLs. And as I'll point out later, it's important to note that not all building footprints are BSLs, and not all BSLs are represented by a building footprint. Kimmy, if you can move to the next slide. So now that we have the building footprints, the parcels, the next key attribute or piece of information that we bring in is the tax assessor records we can associate with the parcel and the building footprints. This tax assessor data is again collected by a third-party vendor that we work with. It is pulled from tax assessor records in each county. This data provides key attributes about the use of the land, including land use. Land use could be, it's indicated that it's a residential single family, could be indicated that's an industrial. Those land uses are important to our process. It provides potential building improvement values that have occurred on that land. It provides the address that the assessor is associated with that parcel. And it might provide building information such as building footprint or the primary building footprint size, number of units, number of stories, and other pertinent information that we pull into our modeling methods. In the center image, we finally bring in the address data from other sources. So we've got some address information from the tax assessor. We now go to additional data sources to pull in a complete list of addresses that we can associate with that fabric data. This address information provides key information to users of the data. One, it provides that textual linkage. Most parties don't know the latitude and longitude at which they reside, but they know the address at which they reside. So we need that textual linkage for people to interact with the fabric. It also provides postal information about the nature of the property. Is it a residential or non-residential location? And then we can also use the collection of addresses to determine the number of units at an individual BSL. In the last image on the right, we show, using the blue dots that you can see, that the BSLs that we have identified in this image, this blank slate that we started with. It is important to note that not one source is sufficient in identifying the BSLs. They all play a part. They're a piece part in the puzzle, and each provides critical evidence. It is working through that collection of data that we're able to identify the BSLs. And we do this using our machine learning models. Kimia, if you can move to the next slide. So let me dig into our machine learning modules that we use. There are actually two primary types of models, what we call BSL Pro and IntelliStructure. BSL Pro model identifies if the parcel has a BSL on it, which is basically what I walked you through in the prior slides of working through that data collection to identify if the parcel has a BSL. Once we identify the parcel has a BSL, we then use our IntelliStructure model to identify which structure on the parcel is the BSL. In IntelliStructure, we again start with a blank slate, as shown in the image on the left. We then bring in building footprints. As part of this, we pre-filter any footprints that appear to be sheds and huts. So in that center image, you'll see that we did not light up the sheds and huts. They were pre-screened out of the process to help improve the overall predictive capability of the model. Using the attributes of the buildings that remain, including the building height, the complexity, the roof slope, the size, the distance to the roads, and other measures, we select what we believe to be the BSL on the property, as we show in the blue dots on the image on the right. The key takeaways from these slides are BSLs are not always represented by building footprints. There may be instances where the building footprint imagery is somewhat dated, and we have to rely on other sources to identify the BSL. It's important to note that BSLs are a subset of building footprints. So as you see in this image on the screen, not all of the footprints are tagged as BSLs. And the final thing is that multiple data sets are required to understand the nature of footprints on the parcel. Kimia, if you can go to the next slide. So now let's circle back to our discussion today, which is challenges. Let me walk through a few issues to keep in mind as you consider your challenges. In the image on the left, we show a forested area that at some point in the past was parceled and addresses were assigned. However, this area was never built out. As such, BSLs do not exist on these parcels. The key takeaway, again, is that all parcels and all addresses are not necessarily equivalent to a BSL. While each data source is a good piece of information, they're not the final source. We need evidence that a BSL structure exists on the property. In the middle image, if we can shift to a different concept to understand, a BSL represents a single building structure. In this image, the fabric identifies 6 BSLs. Each BSL carries a primary address and a count of units in the BSL. In this case, we have 35 units spread across the 6 BSLs. In ISP systems, so in your building systems or your engineering systems, these 35 condos, as they turn out to be, may be considered single-family units, each with a specific location and each with a specific address. It is important to understand that addresses, you could, let me restart. It is important to understand that addresses that you could match on this parcel are not necessarily missing BSLs. Rather, it may be an issue of a missing count of units or missing secondary addresses. As such, as Steve will cover in the next section, for the identification of BSL locations served by an ISP, if you're using address matching, it is best to combine address matching with some sort of geospatial analysis. In the final image on the right, we show an area where new construction has taken place. In this version of the fabric, we were able to identify BSLs in the area. The question is our data current enough that it captured all of the completed new construction? In certain areas, due to the vintage of our data, whether it be the aerial photography that we use, the tax assessor information, or other sources, that new construction may not be captured in the current version, but may be captured or will be captured in future releases. If you have access to more current information in these areas, we would welcome them as BSL challenges as long as you can provide a valid address on those locations. If you can move to the last slide. As a final note, as you consider the magnitude of your challenges, I would like to walk you through some high-level statistics to keep in mind as you create your challenge data. As the fabric vendor, there are quality statistics we must meet with each release. This image that you see captures a sampling of these quality statistics. Here we show that in testing, we currently capture 99.3% of the parcels that have a BSL. In selecting the BSL from the footprints on the parcel, we successfully select the correct structure on the parcel over 98% of the time. In reviewing addresses, we show that we are consistent with other tools used in the industry. And finally, in testing residential unit counts, we match the census block group level housing unit counts in over 99% of the census block groups in the country. In fact, we match 99.9% of the time. Let me wrap it up by saying that we have undertaken an extensive effort to develop the first version of the fabric. And while we believe we have delivered a high-quality data set, we know it's not perfect. The fabric might have points in the wrong place. For example, we may have picked the garage instead of the house. We may have too few units at a location. Or we have issues with the residential or business designation. And finally, we may have the incorrect address. That's what the challenge process is for. But within the limits of the data, we generally have credible sources that align with other data sources. If you're seeing significant issues, such as a high count of missing BSLs, you should take a closer look as to what the nature of the issue is. It may not be simply missing BSLs. It may be a missing count of units or missing secondary addresses. And now let me turn it over to Steve Rosenberg, who will overview the fabric challenge tips.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim said, I'm going to walk through some tips for how to prepare and think about generating fabric challenges. It's a little bit hard for me to tell you exactly what you should or shouldn't do because a lot depends on the data you have and how authoritative and reliable your data sources are, and what resources you can bring to bear. It also depends a lot on the type of challenges you want to make. So we'll try to give you some clarity where we can, but a lot of what follows will be recommendations, not requirements or prohibitions. One point that we can say clearly is that you should carefully follow the bulk fabric challenge data specification. If we indicate that a field is required for a particular type of challenge, it's because that information is essential to the BDC and to analyzing challenges. We'll talk more about the data spec in a little bit, but if you're struggling to compile the data asked for in the spec, then consider whether you have an adequate evidentiary basis for submitting a challenge for that location. Another point that's broadly applicable, something of a theme you'll see in a lot of our tips, is that local knowledge matters. Having someone familiar with the areas you're filing data about will help improve the quality of what you give us and of the fabric. Now, for some types of challenges, you may have ready access to very reliable data, and the challenge might be pretty straightforward. For example, if you're an ISP and you have or previously had a mass market customer at a location that the fabric said isn't mass market, that's exactly the kind of data we want to get from you. Or conversely, if you serve a location with an enterprise service that the fabric indicates is residential, please file a challenge and help us update the fabric data. As another example, if you have data that says that a location is a residential electric power customer, that data could support a challenge to add that location to the fabric or change a BSL flag from false to true if it's in the fabric as a non-residential or non-BSL location. Other challenge types may involve more complex preparation and review. To add or remove a BSL, we really recommend, as Jim said, looking at a map. It's more technically accurate to say that we recommend a geospatially enabled process, not simply a text or database process. If you want to add a BSL, for example, it's important to make sure that the point is in the footprint of a structure, but not in the footprint of an existing BSL. As Jim just explained and as Chelsea mentioned, a BSL, or I guess it was Kirk, a BSL is defined as a structure. So if you are identifying a location that already has a BSL flag on it, simply adding an address will not add a new BSL there. We highly recommend not using a geocoder. Statutory requirements aside, if the commission thought geocoders were good enough, we wouldn't have the need for the fabric. When staff looked at geocoder data for some rural, hard-to-serve locations, we found that different geocoders reported very different locations from one another for the same address. And even geocoder returns with high confidence scores were often off in the middle of a field or a forest. There can also be issues with data rights that go along with geocoders. Many terms of service restrict your ability to store geocode returns or to compare data to other sources. Beyond that, the approach you should take depends on the kind of data you're starting from. So for example, if you're starting from a geospatial data set like E911 data or a data set with electric meter locations, the biggest challenge is probably making sure that you're ensuring that challenges for particular locations align with the definition of BSLs discussed earlier. Those other data sources are made for other purposes. For example, in E911 data, you probably want first responders to have a more specific location than we will need for BSLs. So driveways, individual unit numbers, entrance points, not just an address or a single rooftop point for a large apartment complex. But as I said, BSLs are defined at the level of a structure. So if you're using a data set with made for another purpose to generate fabric challenges, you'll need to look at both the data associated with a location to figure out which locations are broadband serviceable. And you'll also need to look at the geospatial elements, such as figuring out whether any locations you have are within the footprint of a structure already flagged as a BSL in the fabric. If you're starting from address data are just really hard to use, as I'm sure everybody who works with addresses is aware. The point isn't to say that you can't use address data, but it's worth flagging some of the difficulties. One is that there are different address standards. The fabric uses USPS data, USPS address standardization, and the vast majority of addresses are CAST validated. So filers that use different standards will need to build a bridge just to do a comparison of addresses. Another issue is that a lot of addresses are associated with places that don't necessarily have structures. Sometimes areas are parceled up and given addresses long before a shovel hits the ground. And of course, some address data sets have errors that mean some of the individual addresses are incomplete. For example, they might be missing a digit from a zip code, or that just don't exist in real life. And I think Jim showed an example of some of that from some real data. And all of that is before you get to the fact that buildings can have more than one address. That can come from multiple names for a road, a building that faces one road, more than one road, or individual units having distinct addresses in a building. So if you have an address that you believe is missing from the fabric, you need to figure out its lat-long coordinates, what building footprint that address sits on, and whether that building is already captured in the data as being a location, whether it's indicated with as being a BSL or a non-BSL in the fabric. So a lot of geospatial work, not just the database kinds of processes that would go along with that. That's a lot of ground that I've run through quickly, and apologies if I'm speaking too quickly. But I want to cover a couple of other topics that are very important to everyone looking to file bulk challenge data. First, the way the fabric and BDC work, we don't assign the same address to more than one location. We don't want an ISP that is matching addresses to create their BDC filing to enter one address and get 2 points returned when they might offer service only to one of those. What that means is that your challenges need to provide that address uniqueness. For example, if the fabric has 2 points with the addresses swapped, if you submit only one correction, we'll have an address conflict and the system will reject the challenge. But if you give us both updates, so the end effect is to have unique addresses, that should process through. If you're submitting a new address, and this applies in any kind of challenge, we highly recommend making sure that that address doesn't appear elsewhere in the fabric. and that if that address does appear elsewhere in the fabric, to figure out what additional changes are needed to come up with that unique set of addressing across all of your challenges. When there is a challenge with an address conflict that isn't resolved, the processing will not incorporate that challenge information. Second point, it may be that you need to file multiple challenges for a single BSL. For example, if we've identified the wrong building and mischaracterized something as an enterprise when it should be mass market, you'll file 2 challenges, one to correct each issue. Lastly, our focus and our mandate is to develop a collection that facilitates challenges and provides a wide range of stakeholders with opportunities and pathways to challenge the data that we are collecting. Broad participation will yield the most accurate maps. We know that the first step to connecting everyone everywhere is to develop accurate information in the fabric about what locations need broadband service. We're also aware that by statute, funding decisions will be made based on the data reflected in our maps. We invite your partnership and your engagement in this challenge process. You should examine, related to that, as you're giving us data, keep in mind that the FCC's maps will be publicly available, and a future version of the map will reflect the results of successful challenges. That's the version of the map that will reflect data as of December 2022 or later. The updated fabric will also be made available to licensees, such as broadband providers and state and tribal governmental organizations and other third-party licensees. Therefore, please make sure that you have the appropriate data rights to submit your challenge data. So to restate that a little bit, you should make sure, you should examine the data ownership and your ability to submit challenge data as part of your process. And if necessary, we suggest that you review your plans with your counsel. Generally, your participation in the challenge process will help improve our data collection going forward. But if you are unable to participate, we will still continue to improve the fabric through other challenge processes, the bulk challenge that's going on now, and individual challenges, as well as updates to source data and to CostQuest analytics. A couple of final sort of housekeeping issues. The system will limit a single bulk upload, a single bulk challenge upload to 250,000 records. We may increase that limit in the future, and we will make an announcement if we do so. But for the time being, if you plan to submit a large number of challenges, please break up bulk challenges into individual challenge submissions, each with a file of 250,000 records or fewer. Also, if you plan to file more than 250,000 challenge records, or you have more challenges in an area than you might expect, we recommend that you email the BDC team at broadbanddatainquiries@fcc.gov. That's broadbanddatainquiries@fcc.gov. And we will help facilitate a conversation with CostQuest to discuss the types of challenges you plan to file. Next, we'll see a video demonstration of the Fabric Challenge interface. Following the video, we'll take a 10-minute break, and when we return, we will begin the Q&A portion of the program. As a reminder, please submit questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov.
As part of the broadband data collection, entities have the opportunity to submit challenges and propose corrections to the information in the FCC's Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. Service providers, governments, and other entities and organizations are able to submit bulk challenges to the fabric in the BDC system. Bulk fabric challenge data must be submitted in the BDC system via file upload and must conform to the data specifications. More information on the bulk fabric challenge process can be found online at the BDC Help Center at help.bdc.fcc.gov. After logging into the BDC and selecting your entity, you can begin the bulk fabric challenge process on the submissions dashboard page by clicking the Create Submission button. In the modal that appears, select Crowdsourced Challenge as your submission type, and then Bulk Fabric Challenge as your crowdsourced challenge type. Clicking the Create Submission button will close the modal and create a link to the Bulk Fabric Challenge page within this table. Simply click that Bulk Fabric Challenge link to proceed. This page is where you can begin entering your Bulk Fabric Challenge data. Upon your initial visit to the page, you will see 2 cards, a submissions card and a total challenges card. The submissions card will give you a total count of bulk fabric challenge submissions you have filed from this entity. the FCC can review each individual submission from your FRN and can accept or reject your submission based on the data you've uploaded. This is depicted by the under review, accepted, and rejected counts here. It is important to remember that the counts in the submissions card represent the number of certified bulk fabric challenge filings your FRN has filed. The total challenges card displays the count of individual challenges contained within your submissions. For example, if I upload and certify a CSV with 50 fabric challenge records, the system considers that as one submission containing 50 total challenges. The total challenge count will include a subset of pending, accepted, and rejected fabric challenges. Upon initial upload, your challenges will be listed as pending, and once they have been adjudicated by the FCC, they will be listed as accepted or rejected. It is important to note that the total challenges count will only include a count of challenges within accepted submissions. For example, if you upload a file containing 50 fabric challenges, but that submission is either under review or has been rejected by the FCC, the total challenges count will not include any challenges from that submission. Only once a submission has been accepted will the total challenges count be updated, and the table on this page will be populated within your fabric challenge data. To initiate the bulk fabric challenge process, clicking the Create Submission button will take you to the first of 3 data upload steps. From here, clicking the Upload button will open a modal that will allow you to upload your challenge data, either in CSV or zip format. Please note that only one fabric challenge file can be uploaded at a time, so if you choose to upload a zipped file, that zipped file must only contain a single CSV. To begin the upload process, click the Upload Data button and select the file you wish to upload from your local machine. There are multiple validations performed in your data as the file is processing, including checks for acceptable column names, validations within individual cells, and safeguards against uploading duplicate data. For a complete list of data specifications for bulk fabric challenge data, please visit the BDC Help Center. You will also see a reference ID presented to you as your file is being processed. This reference ID is unique for all challenges uploaded within the BDC system. Once your file has completed processing, you will see a green check mark in the Upload Challenge File card, and you'll notice that the Upload Evidence card has been unlocked. Your file also now contains a status of valid data, and a table has populated on the page previewing the data included within your file. In this instance, you can see that my file had 61 total records, which has been categorized within a file summary table by challenge type here. If I'd like to examine my process data further, I can click on this Download Process Data link to view a CSV. If I don't want to proceed with this file, I can simply click the Delete icon to start the process over. If your data looks accurate, you can proceed to the Upload Evidence step by clicking on this card. Within this step, you must provide either an evidence file or an evidence description. This information will assist the FCC with learning more about the challenge records you have included within your submission. You can upload an evidence file by clicking on the Upload File button here, and then selecting a PDF from your local machine. Once that file has finished processing, you will see a status of valid data, and the certified data card at the top of the page will be unlocked. You can also provide an evidence description with your submission by clicking the Edit Description button here. You enter your descriptive text and click Save. You can also edit your description by clicking on this button here on the page. It's important to note that you must provide either an evidence file or an evidence description to proceed towards the certified data page. On the certified data card, you can view a brief summary of the data you have included within your submission, including challenge file name, record count within your submission, the date you uploaded your data, and whether you have included an evidence file or evidence description. You can also click on this View Map link to preview your submission on a map. Within this map, you will see a file record count and a selected record count, which is based upon your filtered selections. For example, if I filter the map to show only challenges for incorrect location unit count, the selected record count will update and the map will display all 23 locations where the challenge type equals incorrect location unit count. Hovering my mouse over a location will display a tooltip with information for that individual record. You'll note that each record has been assigned a unique challenge ID, and the tooltip contains additional information related to that challenge, including contact name, address, and an associated fabric location ID. This map behaves the same as other maps within the broadband data collection, allowing you to pan and zoom to view more information on your challenge data. If your challenge data is depicted accurately on the map, you can return to the Certified Data page to complete your submission. Simply click on this Certify button here, read the certification text, and enter your contact information within this modal. You can also click this checkbox here to automatically populate the fields using the information you previously provided on your entity information page within the BDC. Once you've completed your contact information, click the Certified Data button to complete your submission. You will now be presented with a Certified Submissions page, which displays a table of all Fabric submissions you've submitted for this FRN. Because this is my first submission for this FRN, my table only includes one row. However, if I were to certify another submission, this table would then display multiple records. You will also see that my status is displayed here as under review, which means that the FCC is currently reviewing the validity of my data. If my submission is accepted by the FCC, this status will be updated to accepted, and the individual challenges included within my submission will be submitted for further review. If my submission is rejected for any reason, this status will be updated to rejected, and my individual challenges will not be submitted for further review. When I return to the Bulk Fabric Challenge page, you can see that my submissions count has been updated to 1, which reflects the under review submission that I just completed. My total challenges count is still 0 and will remain so until I have a submission accepted by the FCC. For this example, I'm going to display what the page will look like when a submission is accepted by the FCC. As I refresh my page, you'll now see that my submissions count displays 1 accepted submission, and my total challenges card now displays a count of 61 records, each of which is pending. I can view each individual challenge within this table on the page, and I can filter the table by selecting one or more of these drop-down menus, or by entering a specific challenge ID or location ID to narrow my search. For each record in the table, I can click this View Details link to see additional information for each challenge. This information includes a date received and status for the challenge at the top of the modal, as well as a map of the location being challenged. The modal also contains additional location data, challenge data, and contact information. At the top of the page, you'll notice 2 links: Download Challenge Results and View Map. The Download Challenge Results file is a CSV that allows you to download all data depicted in the table on this page. In this instance, my file will only include data related to the lone submission I have certified. However, if I had certified multiple submissions, this file would include data across each of the submissions I have certified. Clicking on the View Map link will display a map of all challenge locations across each of my submissions. Because I've only certified one submission in this example, my map is only displaying the 61 records included in that submission. However, if I had multiple certified submissions, this map would display location points across each of my certified submissions. One additional feature on this map is the ability to filter by status. In this case, all of my location points are listed as pending, as my data was just submitted to the FCC. However, if any of my challenges were accepted or rejected by the FCC, they would be reflected on this map, and I could filter the map by those statuses. Off screen, I'm going to accept one challenge so that I can showcase this feature on the map. See that as I refresh the page, I now have one accepted point on the map, indicated by this green circle. As I hover over the location, you'll see that the tooltip also reflects the updated status for this location point. If I click this accepted checkbox here in the status column, you'll see that the map zooms to the accepted location point. If I return to the bulk fabric challenge page and refresh it, you'll now see that I have one accepted challenge among my 61 total challenges. Within the bulk fabric challenge table, I also have the option to withdraw one or more challenges at a time. For this example, I'm going to click this checkbox for these 3 challenges. Then click the withdraw button above the table. A modal will appear asking me to confirm my decision, as withdrawing a challenge is an action that cannot be undone. Now that those 3 challenges have been withdrawn, you can see that my total challenges count has diminished by 3, and now have 58 total challenges, with 57 of those pending and 1 of those as accepted. To review any withdrawn challenges, I can click on this withdrawn link here within the table. You can see that this tab now includes the 3 challenges I withdrew in the previous step. From this page, I can also click on the Certified Submissions link, which displays an archive of every submission I've certified for this FRN. You'll notice that the status for my previous submission now says accepted, where before it was under review. The reference ID is clickable and allows me to review the data I've included in my previous submission. I can download my original challenge file or evidence data by clicking on the link for the file name, and I can view evidence details and certification details that I included within my submission. I can also return to this view map link here to see a map of data associated with my original submission. This can be useful in cases where multiple submissions have been certified and you'd like to view maps by submission rather than by all challenges associated with your FRN. This concludes the walkthrough of the BDC Bulk Fabric Challenge process. For additional information, including data specifications and video tutorials, please visit the BDC Help Center, which can be accessed at any time by clicking the Help link at the top of the page within the BDC system.
Welcome back. For the question and answer portion of today's event, I'm joined by Chelsea Fallon, Senior Implementation Officer of the Broadband Data Task Force, Kirk Berge, who is our Senior Counsel, Steve Rosenberg, who's the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at the FCC, and Jim Stegman, who's President of CostQuest. As a reminder, you can email questions to bdcwebinar@fcc.gov. We've received a lot of questions, and we'll do our best to cover them. If we're unable to get to your question, you may submit it via the FCC's online help center at www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. And there's a lot of other information, videos, and FAQs that may be helpful on that site as well. Okay, so for questions and answers, the first question I will take. The chairwoman's blog referred to September 12th as the opening up of a challenge process window. The PN doesn't mention an end date. Is it an ongoing process? And is it advisable to file by a certain date? The answer to that is fairly simple. We're planning to accept challenges on a rolling basis, so there is no end date for the challenge process. However, we do need to make the fabric available to filers in advance of the December 31st as of date for the next BDC availability filing window. So obviously we want to encourage entities with fabric challenges who will be filing bulk fabric challenges to file their data as soon as you are able, so that we can do all of the complex processing that's Steve and Jim described, and in order to be in time to be able to publish a new fabric for that next collection. Steve, I think the next one's for you.
Okay, so questions. I have a large number of addresses that I'm not matching the fabric. Why might that be happening, and how do I get those added? So, sorry, this may be kind of a long answer, but there are a few different things that might be going on here. So one problem might just be the active address matching. So for example, if your systems have a town name that's a bit different than the USPS does, something that's not really that uncommon, you might be missing a large number of addresses in that town. So we recommend trying to match using zip code and excluding town names, or maybe it's the opposite problem that the zip has changed and you need to run without the zip code, but with the town name. As I mentioned earlier, addresses can be very difficult to work with. Similarly, the fabric might have the wrong address for a given location. So for example, 123 Main Street might mistakenly show up as 125 Main Street in the fabric. So if you're looking at a map or a geospatial process, that could be helpful here. So if this is the case, what you want to do is use a type 2 challenge to change the address from 125 to 123 rather than adding a new BSL. If you instead try to add a BSL and don't hit a building that's not already in the fabric, in other words, if you submit a challenge to add a BSL for 125 Main Street, you hit 123 or vice versa. Now I've gotten my example confused, I'm sorry. Your challenge would be rejected because you've already hit an existing BSL. Another possibility that I alluded to earlier is that you might have an address for an individual condo or substructure that's part of a larger building that is already identified as a BSL. This is incredibly common in condos, townhouse-like structures that are on one parcel, and certain types of apartments. So to put this into perspective, keep in mind that the fabric has 114 million BSLs, and there are over 140 million housing units in the United States based on census data. That means that there are literally tens of millions of addresses that are captured by or part of an existing BSL in the fabric. If the addresses correspond to a building that's already in the fabric, there's really no need to file a challenge on your part. The fabric might not reflect all the addresses, but the BSL is in there. That's why I recommended earlier incorporating geospatial work into your analysis so that you're not simply working from a list of addresses. We are looking into adding more addresses to that secondary address file that we talked about earlier. So this is less of an issue. And also keep in mind that there can be this issue with addresses that are not yet built. When you're confident the addresses you're dealing with represent buildings that aren't in the fabric and that those locations meet the requirements for a BSL that Kirk described, you'll submit a type 1 challenge to add a BSL to the fabric. You'll need all the information for that BSL except for the fabric ID, which the system will generate. So address, unit count, building type code, and of course, latitude and longitude. There are exceptions for areas that are not addressed too, if that's required. Keep in mind that if you're adding a new BSL with an address that's already assigned to another location, you'll need to make sure you can reconcile that as part of your bulk challenge, as part of your submission.
I think the next one's mine. The question is, what happens if the location doesn't have an address? Does that mean I can't add a BSL? So there are areas that genuinely lack addresses. It's not common, but it does happen. And there's a field in the challenge data spec to allow you to note that the location lacks an address. But you need to keep in mind that this is only for areas where there is no U.S. Postal Service deliverable addressing. If you mark this field in an area that otherwise has addresses, your challenge might be rejected, even if it's otherwise correct.
All right, I think the next one is mine. How do I get access to the fabric as a state, local, or tribal government? So if you do not already have one, the first thing to do would be to obtain an FCC username and password, as well as an FCC registration number or an FRN for your entity in CORS. That's the Commission's registration system. And when you create your FRN, you must select the entity type there that matches your government type. So the options there are federal, state, or local, or tribal. Then you would go log into the BDC system at bdc.fcc.gov using the username and password created in CORS. There you should see the FRN that you created and that your username is associated with. You would select that FRN and then enter the entity information for your governmental entity. Then the FCC staff will review that information and provide the contact information of the approved entities to CostQuest. And typically within 3 to 5 business days, CostQuest will email the certifying official with further instructions and a link to CostQuest website to create a user account there. Then the person authorized to sign a license on behalf of the entity should submit a license request form in order to execute a licensing agreement with CostQuest. When the license is signed, a link to download the data file will be emailed to the recipients. In case you missed any of that, we do have an article, a help article on our BDC Help Center page that goes through these steps there as well. Another question we've gotten is that the bulk challenge data spec has a lot of field dependencies based on the type of challenge, and is there a cheat sheet that summarizes these dependencies from this data specification? Yes, there is. So in the BDC Help Center, which is the URL that Jean has given out, www.fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. If you search BDC challenge matrix, or I think if you click the link to the location fabric tile on the homepage, you'll get to a help article that provides a matrix that lays out all of these different dependencies, and you can download that image as a reference.
I think the next question is mine, and the question is, our county maintains the MSAG, which is a Master Street Address Guide. Can I submit address changes to follow this standard? The answer is likely yes, but we do verify addresses as whether they're valid. And because some standards we've seen are not consistent with USPS standards, our suggestion would be to run a sample of addresses through the USPS address validator to make sure the addresses are acceptable in a format that flow in that meet the USPA qualifications. With that, the next validation would be to make sure that you have all the required fields as defined in the bulk challenge specification. Next question is also mine. Can I share the fabric data with contractors helping my organization to develop challenge data? The answer is yes. The FCC Tier 2 license allows an organization to share fabric data for BDC purposes with authorized users, which includes the licensee's affiliates, personnel, and subcontractors. I can imagine a use case where the authorized user could be helpful to street address or street verify addresses or develop evidence files to substantiate challenge submissions.
Great. I can take the next question. In comparing my hub submissions to the fabric, I see hub submission records that are not in the fabric. Can I submit those missing points as a fabric challenge? And so the hub system, which is used for reporting locations in high cost universal service programs, and the fabric, they are different data sources. They're developed for different purposes. And as others have pointed out, the definition of a BSL differs from the location records that are submitted in the hub. However, ISPs can compare their hub data with the data in the fabric, and using geospatial analysis or other tools that we've described today can perform an analysis to determine whether all of the locations served by the ISP are reflected in the fabric. If not, then the ISP may submit challenges for any missing locations. We note that there will be additional fields that are not in the hub dataset that need to be added to comply with the bulk fabric challenge data specification. And then based on the information submitted as a challenge, each record will be viewed for suitability. Also keep in mind that the rules for filing hub data allow for the use of, for example, commercially geocoded addresses, even if the coordinates are not clearly associated with a building of any kind. And that's not the case for identifying BSLs as part of the broadband data collection.
I'll take the next question. The question is, I have actual mass market customers that are not showing up as BSLs. Can I submit a challenge about that? Yes, you may. We encourage that. The particular type of challenge is going to depend a bit on the exact circumstances, as is the case with most of the challenges, I think. If the location is in the fabric with the BSL flag marked as false, for example, if you have a community anchor or enterprise location, you'll challenge the building type code, which is challenge type 4. This is the same if the fabric shows the location as a BSL, but as a business rather than a residence. If the fabric lacks the location entirely, you would want to add a BSL, which is a type 1 challenge. So this is exactly the type of knowledge that we're hoping to get through the challenge process, and we urge you to participate to the greatest extent you can.
I'll take the next question. How do I submit a challenge to change a BSL flag? In the system, you can't. In the challenge system, you can't change the BSL flag. You have to change other attributes about it to impact that. If you find a location shouldn't be a BSL, it's a barn that was misidentified and should be taken out, but we indicate that its BSL flag is true, you can use the challenge type 6, which indicates that the BSL should be removed. And then we will take it out of the fabric and it will no longer exist and the BSL flag will be set to 0. If, on the other hand, it is a BSL, you believe it is a location, but it is a community anchor or other type, that is a challenge type 4, and you would change the building type code, and then that would flow through to change the BSL flag.
The next question is for me. I keep recommending a geospatial process. So the question is, I can't afford GIS software. Some of the commercial products are very expensive for me. What should I do? There are a number of open source tools that might be very useful for you. I've used QGIS myself a good deal. It's great for visualization and some of the geospatial processing. If you prefer scripting or coding, I've used a lot of GeoPandas, and that can be a good tool. Also PostGIS. And while PostGIS doesn't have visualization tools built in, or at least it didn't the last time I used it, QGIS connects to PostGIS in a very straightforward manner. So there's sort of a suite of different open source tools that you can use without incurring a lot of cost. Next one is mine as well. If I have proprietary data sources that I use to submit fabric challenges, do those data become the property of the FCC or CostQuest as a result of my submitting a challenge? So let me start by mentioning something I said before, that the FCC maps will be publicly available, and they will reflect new or updated BSLs that come as a result of successful challenges. And the updated fabric itself will be made available to licensees like broadband providers, state and tribal, and local governmental organizations and other third-party licensees. So it's important that we be able to share the data. Having said that, the underlying data sources that you use do not become the property of the FCC or of CostQuest. The actual challenge data that you submit into the BDC does become owned by the FCC, where we retain rights to correction data as part of the whole BDC process. Rights in and permissible use of the fabric data, including corrections data, are governed by the FCC's contracts with CostQuest. They do not take ownership of the data. So given this, we would encourage entities using proprietary data sources to ensure they have sufficient data usage rights or other permissions to use these data for the purposes of participating in the Fabric Challenge process. Is that next one mine as well? Am I on a roll? I just keep going. All right. The bulk Fabric Challenge's PN states that the challenge data must include, among other things, evidence supporting a challenge. Can you elaborate on the types of evidence that we're going to be looking for? So the types of evidence needed to support a challenge will depend very heavily on the category of challenge submitted. So the bulk Fabric Challenge specification outlines which fields are required for responses based on the category of challenge. So for example, in the case of a challenge to add a missing BSL, category code 1, the challenger must provide an address unless the location doesn't have an address, in which case there's a field to indicate that, unit count, building type code, latitude, longitude for the location. So basically all the information except the ID. Very different if you were just changing, for example, as Jim was describing, the building type code or the unit count. For your evidence file, we would encourage filers to submit a high-level description of the data sources or methodology used to prepare your challenges at a minimum, to the extent that you can point to specific knowledge that you have that might be helpful for us to know about as well.
The next one's mine. Are providers required to submit bulk Fabric challenges? No, you're not. It's a voluntary process, as is an individual Fabric challenge. But there are lots of reasons why we think you should want to submit challenges, not the least of which is that your data, your availability data would be as accurate as it can be. So I encourage you to do that, but it is voluntary.
All right, I think there are next couple I can take. So is the category code number 6 location is not broadband serviceable for abandoned locations or structures. So yes, if you have evidence that a building or location that is in the Fabric is abandoned, this would be the appropriate category to use for that challenge. There are other uses for this category code, and I think this brings me to the next question. If a residential BSL has a second location ID assigned to the garage or the shed on the property, should I submit a challenge to have that removed? And yes, if second building or potentially other buildings identified as BSLs do not actually meet the requirements of a BSL, would be helpful for us to have that information and update the Fabric. And I think category code is the correct one to use for that.
I think the next one is mine. Will the Fabric ID remain the same or will it change biannually? So we're working hard to try and ensure that Fabric IDs do not change over time. There are some circumstances, however, when we will have to generate a new Fabric ID. For example, if we accept a challenge that we have identified the wrong building on a property, so moving from one structure to another, from the garage or a shed onto the house, that newly identified BSL will have a new Fabric ID that wasn't in the data set before. But when we've got Fabric locations that are not moving, they're not changing structures, we expect those to remain constant over time.
I've got the next one. Can you help me understand why anchor institutions, schools, city government, et cetera, were not allowed to be entered into the initial BDC filing? Should these BSLs be entered into the challenge process? So this goes back originally to the Broadband Data Act, which required us to develop a collection of mass market services. And when the second report and order was released, I think it was, the commission decided that it would, because community anchor institutions in general would not would be looking at enterprise service, that they would not be a part of the collection initially. To the extent an anchor institution uses mass market broadband services that is actually taking that, subscribing to them, it'd be helpful for us to get that information through the challenge process to take into account in updating further future iterations of the fabric.
Okay, here's one. We have identified locations that were not included in the fabric data, and we'll be submitting those locations in a bulk challenge. Once verified and linked to a fabric ID, will there be an opportunity to add the technology and speeds associated for those locations and update our filing? So the version of the fabric that will be used for each filing round for the biannual BDC availability submissions, that will be updated and made available before the start of the next filing window. And so then that will be the version of the fabric used kind of throughout that filing window. So prior to the filing round that opens December 31st of this year, a new version of the fabric will be available. And then ISPs submitting fixed availability data can use and will need to use that version of the fabric when reporting the information about their technology and speed and business residential category of service for that next filing round. And then there's a question here, and we've received a few questions here that are actually really related to one of our other BDC challenge processes, which will be coming soon, which is for challenges to the fixed availability information. So for example, one question is if AT&T is serving a location with DSL that has a maximum speed of 3 megabits per second, do you consider that served? And so the fixed availability challenge process will launch later this year once the BDC broadband maps are published and all of that fixed availability data that's been submitted by ISPs is made available. The challenge process that is opening on September 12th is really just for corrections to the fabric data. So just wanted to make that distinction and kind of stay tuned for more information on the fixed challenge process.
So I've got the next question. Do you expect to clean up the BSL flags? There seem to be many false flags where it appears that locations should be true. So if we understand the question, we think you're asking about where the BSL flag is set to being false. That is, it's shown as not a BSL, where you as a challenger believe it should be BSL true. So as I touched on in my prior response, we're using the best data sets we can to identify high bandwidth businesses. But if you have local information that indicates that a location record is served by mass market services currently, we'd welcome that type of challenge and your associated evidence of that.
Okay. If our company submitted a polygon for the availability requirement, can we still participate in the fabric challenge process? And the answer is yes. And if you meet the requirements for filing a fabric challenge, the information that you have on what's actually going on in your local area can certainly help us update the location data in the fabric. Just wanted to note that if you're an ISP and you have not accessed the fabric and gone through that process, you would need to do that in order to participate in the bulk fabric challenge process. And there is information on how to do that on our website. And then there is a question here, do you expect ISPs to challenge missing locations? And if so, do you expect ISPs to spend the effort to track down the addresses? I mean, I think basically we welcome all the information that various stakeholders have with the relevant data about potential corrections to the fabric. I think a note on, for the ISPs, I think for their filing, we provided a lot of information on address matching and other techniques that can be used to match locations with addresses in the fabric, and would expect those filers to go through that process. But if they still have, information and evidence that location is missing, that information can be submitted as part of a fabric challenge.
I think the next one's mine. We have found many situations where buildings are marked as BSL, but we do not believe that they would be expected to demand broadband services. For example, I own land with a small open air cattle shed. There is electricity to this building, but the building is open to the elements on 2 of the 4 sides. This shed is marked as a BSL in the fabric, in addition to my residence showing as a BSL. Technically, the open air cattle shed might meet the definition, but realistically, there is no demand for broadband for my cows. Should we challenge locations such as these? We've identified hundreds of these and have many thousands more to review, but it is very labor intensive. If we challenge, what evidence would be needed? Well, from a challenge perspective, the answer is yes, we would welcome this kind of challenge. If you're removing a BSL, this is a challenge type 6. If you're removing a BSL, identified as the house instead of the shed, should you encounter that, that is a challenge type 5. As explained by the other speakers, we'd ask you to submit information in your evidence file substantiating your methods and sources behind the challenge. There's a similar question. We have found many situations where the location in the fabric is located on a barn or a cattle shed instead of a single family residence on the same property. Do you want us to challenge these type and provide the correct latitude and longitude? So similar to the last question, yes, we would like to have these challenges. In this case, you would submit a challenge type 5, in which you're moving the latitude and longitude to the correct building.
I have the next question. On the webinar, they stated that anchor institutions should be excluded. Should large businesses also be excluded? And the answer is yes. As we mentioned, non-mass market locations are not BSLs. So we've tried to use the data sets that will isolate locations of non-mass market that would not obtain mass market services. We've identified those in the fabric as BSL flag equals false. But if there are locations that you believe are non-mass market served and should not be BSLs, that is, they're enterprise served and should not be BSLs, we welcome your challenge submission with the appropriate evidence. This would be challenge type 4, setting the building code to either C for CAI or E as a non-mass market location. Next question is for me as well. Kirk mentioned that community anchor institutions are categorically marked as false, given the assumption that they're not served by mass market. But if a CAI is in fact served by mass market services, can the provider add it as such in a challenge? And the answer to that is yes. Not all CAIs, not all community anchor institutions were categorically marked as false. The fabric data makes certain assumptions about whether categories of CAIs receive mass market services. If you have information that conflicts with the way that it was designated in the fabric, then please do submit that information to us.
Okay, if a private company like ours wants to know all the instructions to follow for filing a challenge. Where can we go, or who can we talk to? So the BDC Help Center, again, fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help is a great resource. We have a number of help articles and as well as some tutorial videos and other resources related to the fabric, and we will be adding more in the coming days on the fabric challenge process in particular. So we're hopeful that those resources will be helpful. If you don't find the answer to the question in what is there, you can submit a request by filling out a form on that website, and a customer support specialist can follow up with you and provide some specialized support in helping to format your data or things of that nature.
So next question is mine. Will the FCC be reviewing all challenges to ensure the challenge is accurate, and when will updated locations show up for the public? Do they appear in real time? So the first part of that, the FCC is going to review the challenges kind of on a rolling basis, and we're going to look at not just the challenge data, but also look at sort of the underlying source data that went into creating the fabric, looking, for example, about whether the points fall on existing BSL footprint or not as part of the evaluation process. We've kind of mentioned that example a few times. Revisions to the fabric data that result from challenges will appear in the next version of the fabric. So successful challenges to the current version of the fabric will be incorporated for the version used to collect data for the next filing window for data as of December 31st of this year. The updates will appear in the public maps when we release the maps for the availability data as of December 31st, 2022.
Okay. A related question, will the deployment map released in November of this year be based on the current version of the fabric or an updated version of the fabric that reflects successful challenges? And if a provider submits a successful missing location challenge for a location that it serves, will the provider's reported BDC data automatically be updated, or will it only be updated by the provider during the next BDC submission? So the version of the fabric to be used in each round of the biannual BDC availability submissions will be updated and provided before the start of the filing window. And that updated fabric will incorporate successful challenges and will be produced to use for the next filing window. So, for the December, the round that opens December 31st, a version of the fabric for that round will be submitted, will be published and available prior to December 31st, just as we did in June of this year. And then that version of the fabric will be used during the filing window and for the publication of the data based on that round. So what's published in November will be the fixed availability data based on the fabric that was made available in June for the filing of data as of June 30th. So that will, so that's what that will show. However, we will be taking in fabric challenge data, starting on September 12th and on a rolling basis. But at some point, we will have to process the data that we received in order to publish a new version of the fabric for the next filing round. And then the provider's BDC data is not automatically updated with any updates to the fabric. The provider will need to report availability data for any new or revised locations included in the next version of the fabric once that the next reporting period opens.
I think I have the next question. The question is, we have seen discrepancies in fabric with public housing units. In the fabric, it is shown as one location, yet the complex has 82 apartments and 60 buildings, with some being single-family residents and some being duplex units with 2 residents in a single building. How should this type of discrepancy be challenged? Is it a single challenge? Is it 82 different challenges? Is it incorrect address, secondary address, or what? So let me take part of that first, which is a duplex is a single building or a single BSL that should be filed, and the unit count will be set to 2 to align with what our expectations are. If, however, you think there are missing BSLs on that parcel or in that land area, you should submit challenge type 1, which is a missing BSL, and then provide the latitude and longitude address unit count for those locations so that those can be pulled in. If you think it's just simply a unit count issue, you would file a challenge type, I believe it's 3, to correct those unit types counts so that we have the correct units in the system. And I think next one's Chelsea.
Yeah, thanks. I think the next kind of 2 questions I'll combine. They have to do with the file formatting. First part is I'd like to know where to find the data specifications for bulk challenges. Is it a separate document or spread across help articles? There is one document, data specification document specifically focused on bulk fabric challenge data that was released as part of in conjunction with a public notice that on July 1st of 2022. And you can find that PN on fcc.gov/broadband data. If you go to resources, then there's a tab there that for data specifications, and the bulk fabric data spec is posted there. And then should I use the same CSV format for fabric challenge that I used for the original submission? I assume this is referring to the fixed availability list of location submission. And the answer to that is no. The data specification for bulk fabric challenges is different from the data specification for fixed availability data, as we are collecting different information through those 2 processes. The fields and the header rows are different. They are both in a CSV format, but sort of look at those 2 documents and format those 2 files separately. Thanks,
I think
Steve.
the next one is mine. Yep. How should a provider handle a condo or a townhome where the units are in the same building but have different physical addresses? For example, CostQuest identified a building as a triplex with 1 physical address. However, there are 3 physical addresses, 1 for each unit, and the units are individually owned. In this scenario, would I submit a challenge for the unit value of the existing CostQuest ID from 3 units to 1, then submitting BSLs for the remaining 2 units, or would this not be a challenge at all? So in this example, it sounds as though CostQuest followed the general process and identified a single structure as a BSL and assigned a housing unit count of 3 for the BSL. So if that unit count is correct, that there are 3 housing units associated with the BSL, then there is no challenge to submit here. We have all the right information. Rather, you should look to see if there are additional addresses in the secondary address file, which might be helpful for matching. But even if not, there's 1 representative address in the main fabric file to capture that BSL, and there's no need for a challenge as long as I said, the unit count is correct.
I think the next question I have is about the who can certify challenges. Do they need to be certified by a certified engineer. So for a bulk fabric challenge submission just needs to be certified by a certifying official with a company, government, or organization. And there's more information about that as you're filling out the entity information page of the BDC system. But fabric challenge submissions are not required to be certified by an engineer like the availability filings are.
I've got the next question. Do you expect a separate evidence upload to support each challenge? So that we would expect that for expect a separate evidence file upload for each category of challenge, but not a separate evidence upload for each individual location challenge.
Next question is mine. It is there a process to identify or populate the primary street address, not sub-addresses, that are captured by a single BSL? For example, if 101, 103, 105, and 107 Elm Street are all in the single BDC location, it would be helpful for each BSL record to include a list of known primary addresses associated with units in the BSL. So as Steve mentioned, I think on a prior question, each BSL will have a single primary address associated, and then there will be secondary addresses with that. In the current system, we do not allow multiple primary addresses with a single BSL. So our recommendation would just be to make sure that that secondary address file is correct for that location and that it includes the addresses that we do not have as the primary address. Next question again is mine. Will you be able to demonstrate what a missing location address would look like in the BDC system? Here, there is a specific field in the BDC bulk data challenge spec to accommodate records that don't have an address. When these records are released in the next version of the Fabric release, they will be blank.
I think that brings us to the end of the question and answer session. We certainly have a hot audience, lots of good questions. As a reminder, you can find a variety of technical assistance materials, including knowledge base articles, FAQs, and other technical assistance resources by visiting, I'll say it again, fcc.gov/broadbanddata/help. Questions about the challenge processes can be submitted using the Submit a Request button at that web page at the bottom. So thank you again for taking time to participate in the webinar. Thank you, Chelsea, Steve, Jim, and Kirk, for all of your presentations and dealing with lots of complex questions. We look forward to everyone's participation in the challenge process. It's an important part of what we're doing, and we want to make sure that we make that fabric as accurate and precise as we possibly can. So thank you very much for participating, and take a look at those